prefabs or prefabrications, which is, you'll never hear that word again. We're going to call them prefabs. A prefab in Unity is one of the most important parts of Unity development, and I don't know a single Unity project that I've worked on in the past 5 years that hasn't had at least one prefab hanging out around somewhere. Prefabs are incredibly useful, but what are they? They are an asset. They're just a file on your hard drive that describe a game object. So they're not game objects, but they describe game objects. And it turns out that's a really useful thing to have. So to create a prefab that describes a game object, all we need to do is drag a game object from our hierarchy into our project window. So I just dragged my main camera down into my project window. Now let's take a look at what this created. It did two separate things. The first thing it did is it made a file with the extension .prefab in our project folder. And it is just a text file that quite literally describes a game object. It describes all the various settings and components that the game object has. But it's not a game object. It's just this asset sitting there in the project window. This is the prefab. It did a second thing, in addition to create that file, which is it turned this game object in the main camera in the hierarchy in my scene here, which is a game object. It turned it into what we call a prefab instance. A prefab instance is a game object that instead of storing all of its settings itself, all of the various properties it has, it points to a prefab asset and says, any of my settings, just look at that file and copy it. So here's my main camera. If we go in and change my background color of the game in the prefab file, in the prefab file, we will change the camera in the scene will update, and it will all be changed as well. And you might think, okay, well, why don't we just edit the camera in the scene? Well, often you're making games that have many, many, many different scenes. And often you have one game object, like the player object, like a Mario in a platform game, that exists in every single one of those scenes. And if I want to do something like change the sprite I'm using or change my jump force or whatever, whatever setting on that player, I can go to the prefab, make that change once, and it updates in all of my scenes. And that's amazing. We could also have many different copies of one thing in a scene. You could make a tree prefab, and then you could have that be the mesh of a tree. You make 100 of them, put them all around your scene, go into the prefab, do something like add a breeze sway animation, hit save. Suddenly, 100 times over in your scene, they've been updated. A third use of prefabs is even if you have a project that only has one scene. Currently, this project only has one scene. I plan on it being randomly generated. And I have a canvas, which will only have one copy of it and the only one scene that exists. It allows me to make changes and test them and then revert those changes and use the prefab as like a save state, right? Is this good? Does this work? I don't know. Let's go back and then revert it to the prefab. And doing that requires knowing about overrides. Let's go back to this project. So in my prefab, it's going to copy all the different settings of the prefab, except when it doesn't. So if I move my object's position around, right, we don't need to store that in the prefab. Or if I change the orthographic scale of this. When I did that, I got a little blue line appeared on the left. This word size turned blue, and my inspector, the actual text there, turned bold. And all of those are communicating to, it didn't turn blue, it turned, the label and the text turned bold, and then it got a little blue line next to it. Blue is sort of the prefab color. This is communicating to me that that property is now overriding what the prefab says. So I can have 100,000 trees in my scene, and I can change their size and their color and have them all be a little bit different from each other. Not so much copy and pasting, but they'll still use the mesh of the prefab. So that is the prefab override. In the top of my game object view, I now have a drop down that says overrides, and it can tell me I can revert or apply all of them. That's pretty cool. Applying them will update the prefab, and now all the other instances of this prefab in the scenes will all update, and reverting it will just undo this instance and set it back to what was saved, which is also very useful. If you do change something, you can right click on it and you can apply and revert just that one property. You don't have to do all of them. So let's delete this prefab. And when we do so, the camera that is an instance of the prefab gives me some errors and it's missing. So we don't want to delete prefabs if we have references to them in the scene. We want to do before or after. I see I can't undo. What we want to do before or after that is to right click on the game object and unpack it. I have two options, unpack and unpack completely. In this case, they'll do the same thing. Prefabs can have children prefabs, where I could have a parent object that is like, I don't know, prefab of a car, and I could also have the tires be prefabs, and they're all that moved and rotated. I could change the tires, hub design or something, and they would all update. And then the car would also update and all the children. So unpacking it will remove the connection to the prefab for the topmost prefab, in this case, the only one. And unpacking it completely will remove the connection to the prefab and all of its children prefabs. Nesting prefabs is a pretty recent feature in Unity in the grand scheme of things. I think like 2018, plus or minus a year. So a lot of developers don't use them because they just work the way they know how to work and continue to work. Many are, something isn't broken, don't fix it. So out there you'll see advice like don't nest prefabs, but that's kind of out of date. There's some practices out there. It's not that tricky. Okay, so let's say we have a prefab, right? Here's my game, and I am using a prefab to spawn the bullets. I'm cloning the prefab. The player is cloning the prefab to create the bullet, right? So that's a public game object reference, the bullet there, and I was able to give it a prefab, right? So now I have the bullet here. How do I edit it? Well, the easiest way to edit it is to click on the prefab, and then my inspector will become just like an inspector for a game object. But if we double click on it, we will open up the proper prefab editor, which gives you a sort of local hierarchy and includes all of the children objects of the prefab. For example, I have this bullet visuals child object that I can go in and I can edit. And let's say I want to change the color of a bullet or something. To bright green. Huzzah! Prefabs have been updated. So it looks like you're editing a game object. The easiest mistake to make, I think, with prefabs is you go in and you edit a prefab instance and you meant to edit the prefab. Well, it's easy enough. Usually you can just go to the overrides and hit apply. But oftentimes, it's an easy mistake to make. You overthink it, and it's you forget if you're editing the prefab instance where you click on the prefab and you see all the settings, or if you're editing the prefab where you click on the prefab and you see all the same settings, right? Very easy to make that confusion. That's most of prefabs. Let's see how I'm using them in an actual project. So I'm using them in the canvas, which is my text here. Let's say if I want to go in and change the win text to be bigger, right? I can go in and I can improve that, test it out, see how I like it. If I do like it, I can just apply that setting to the prefab, and that's kind of acting as a save state, right? So important when you're working on teams and groups, even if you're working in a one scene game, to use prefabs because it allows you to version control. Well, as I work on my scene and I edit my main player, what I'm really creating is the main player prefab, and that someone else doing level design who's maybe messing in the same scene is messing with. Well, I can push my changes to the version control of just the prefab file, and then the person editing the scene file can push just the scene file, and we're not going to conflict or mess up. So prefabs are really important for collaboration in Unity. And here I'm using that same workflow, even though I'm not collaborating with anyone on this project as like a save state. So what other overrides are on here? I enabled it. Yeah, just enable it. Okay. In the new recent versions of Unity, if I make a change to an object, like I don't know, I move the position of this invisible object, whatever. I see that this prefab instance has an override in that little blue line in the hierarchy. That's so nice to have as a heads up. So here's my game, my player, which is an orange cube. They move around. There's little items that they might pick up. And you can see in my environment folder, I have all the different prefabs, and they're all like clones and copies of each other. Except for one, which is the one that I was testing and working on, which is this extra rolls. It's like dice in this game. So let's make that a prefab. Let's go to our items. So I already have 2 of them in the scene that I was testing. If I wanted to make the change to one of them, I would have to go and I would have to copy those changes and go here and copy the component and go here and paste the component value. Oh, awful, gross. Let's just delete one. Let's make a prefab out of the other one. And let's put this one back. Oops. Let's put this one. See, I already made the mistake of dragging the wrong thing. What's that, about 0.5 and about 3.5? Yeah. Should use grid snapping. I upgraded to this version of Unity to take advantage of the snapping, and I'm not doing it. Okay. And I don't like that color. So let's update it here on the prefab instance until I like it. And when I do, I'll just apply it. Boom. Updated right down there. Oh, amazing. And now I'm ready to make like a new scene from scratch using my prefab workflow. So now I can go in and I need a manager's component. I need a canvas. I need a camera. I need camera's not a prefab, but maybe I should be. I need, I don't have a time upgrade. So it wouldn't be hard. It wouldn't be, it would be annoying enough to do it. Let's just try. Let's go and give the canvas in there. I don't think I have enough of everything. Let's go and add the player and the bomb. And let's add the initialize managers code. I think that needs to be in managers. Is that prefab not been renamed? Yeah. Managers. Should rename the prefab. And then I think the game should just work and run without, I don't have the camera control stuff working, but I should be able to move. Yeah, game just works. Beautiful. So that's a little bit about prefabs. You always want to keep in mind when you're working on prefabs, am I working on the prefab instance or the prefab file? And just keep that distinction, keep that separation clear in your mind. And if you can do that, all the confusion about prefabs will go away. I can't guarantee it'll go away, but that is almost always the root cause of beginners in Unity messing about, making a mistake, editing the wrong thing, not realizing where they are. Is prefab instance, the prefab file, right? Prefab file just describes the game object. When the game's running, it doesn't really care what is and isn't a prefab. Code may or may not use prefabs to, instantiate and clone a prefab and just make it as a new game object. But it's really an editor tool. It's really an editor workflow assist. So enjoy them, use them, love them. Make a folder, organize them, name them well. Drag and drop from the hierarchy into the project window. Click around, figure it out. You'll do great.